joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I think you recently made the observation that you are beginning to see cracks in the cohesion of the Ukrainian military, which, of course, if your observation is correct, is very, very bad for the Ukraine and for the West. But what causes you to come to that conclusion?
Well, I mean, the critical factor for the Ukrainians, as in any military, is their ability to maintain a consistent line or presence on the line of contact. So you need troops who are trained, equipped, prepared to occupy positions that can tie into the left and to the right, so that there is a solid line of control, span of control over this line of contact with the Russians. But as this war has progressed, Ukraine has taken casualty after casualty after casualty, and they have run out of units to maintain this. And so what you're starting to see is, especially since a great deal of effort has been put into the ongoing counteroffensive near the village of Robotyno in Zaporizhia, that units have been pulled out of the northern area, in the area of Kupiansk, and so there are gaps there, and the Russians are starting to exploit those gaps. And as that happens, the Ukrainians have to pull troops out of other places, and it just becomes basically robbing Peter to pay Paul, but eventually there's nothing left to rob, and these gaps are going to become bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're going to see the Russians being able to just sustain the pressure and push the Ukrainians back. And so that's what I'm talking about.
Are decisions like this being made by Ukrainian senior military command or by NATO officers?
Well, I mean, ultimately, the chain of command is a Ukrainian chain of command. So, of course, the brigade commanders aren't going to respond to orders from NATO, but the Ukrainian commanders receive their instructions from their civilian authority, the president, defense minister, and they're being pressured by NATO. So there's a lot of pressure being put on Ukraine to maintain this offensive in Robotyno. Look, it's a disastrous offensive. It has failed. It is causing them tens of thousands of casualties. Hundreds of tanks and armored fighting vehicles have been destroyed. It's destroying their ability to remain as a viable combat force on the field, and yet they're being pressured by NATO to continue this attack.
I only know of two sources which claim that the Ukrainians have breached, not just approached, but breached the first of the three Russian defensive lines. One is the Wall Street Journal, which based its reporting, continued and repeated reporting, on one source. The other is our friend Matt Van Dyke, who I interviewed this morning. We'll play some of what he said for you in a minute. Are you still confident in your conclusion that no matter what kind of a news blackout the Ukrainians have imposed on the state of battle, from your sources, you are comfortable in saying that the Ukrainians have not breached and not even approached the first of those three rings of Russian defenses?
Well, we're talking about, when you speak about the first defensive line, we're talking about a string of concrete barriers called dragon's teeth. They're basically giant concrete blocks that are designed to impede the movement of armored fighting vehicles and tanks. Right. And I'm confident that the Ukrainians have not put a tank across the dragon's teeth. But let's be very clear here. The way the Russians built this defense, according to the doctrine of the man who wrote it, that is Lieutenant General Alexander Romanchuk, the Ukrainians were supposed to, according to the Russians, the way the Russians planned this, they were supposed to have pushed to Robotyno, taken the village, been compelled by the high ground to pivot to the right and move towards the village of Verbonoyo, which would require them to close with the first line of defense, the dragon's teeth, breach the first line of defense, and head to the second line of defense. This is what the Russians envisioned happening, and it should have happened within the first month of the counteroffensive. So, so first of all, whatever the Ukrainians are doing right now is happening because the Russians want it to happen. This is the defensive doctrine. Second of all, we are now in September. And I'm not my math isn't great, but let's say June, July, August, September, we're into the fourth month of this counteroffensive, and they're now only beginning to accomplish what the Russians thought they should have accomplished by the end of the first month. They are behind schedule. They've run out of troops, run out of equipment. This is not a success. I don't care how you spin it. Russian defense is always based upon mobile defense and flexible defense. They're not going to recreate the Alamo. And so when the Russians pull back and let the Ukrainians come in and kill the Ukrainians, that's what the plan's been all along. But I will tell you this, there are no tanks beyond the Dragon's Teeth. Could the Ukrainians have put some reconnaissance troops across this concrete barrier, gone across, taken a selfie, and then come back? Sure. That's not control of territory. The Ukrainians have not breached the first line of defense. That's with absolute certainty.